just because the President of the United States does not want corporations to care about climate change doesn't mean you shouldn't care about climate change. Frankly, that's a political view of a dinosaur. It is just so out of touch with everything that we know, how we are living, what we are breathing, what we are seeing. We can't be told, don't pay attention to what has happened for political reasons. We have to say, no, we see it, and we're going to respond to it. So the systemic changes in both mitigation and adaptation must continue, despite some of the pushback coming from my country in particular. I have always thought that philanthropy needs to do two things at once. It needs to help alleviate the kind of suffering, misery, disease, hunger that we can all see. We see it, we know it, and if we have a heart, we want to help. And that's exactly what has driven so much philanthropy. However, that is not enough. You know, there's that old saying, if you want to feed a hungry person, give them a fish. If you want to end hunger, teach them to fish. We've got to address the structural, systemic problems that have created the kinds of issues that you all are concerned about, or you would not be here. And so to that extent, it does seem that philanthropy can do several things. I mentioned this climate resilience fund that we are establishing that began as a commitment through the Clinton Global Initiative. Philanthropy is providing the first dollars. It is providing the organizational, administrative efforts to set this fund up, to be sponsoring the efforts to reach out to other funders so that we can get it up and going, and then we can look at making systemic changes. And the systemic changes, when we think about climate change, just very roughly, are certainly in adaptation and mitigation. We have a lot of philanthropy in the United States, as well as here in India, that is a result of the huge amounts of money that have been made from fossil fuels and from the causation of climate change over 100+ years. And of course, most of that is a result of the development in the North, in countries like the United States, the UK, and elsewhere. But certainly it's fair to say that more developed countries in the South, China, India, and others, are making contributions because we haven't made a full-scale enough transition into clean, renewable energy to replace polluting fossil fuels. And you know, when I talk about fossil fuels, I'm not just talking about climate change. I'm talking about the pollution that fills the air in Delhi or Beijing. I'm talking about the clear evidence that pollution is impacting our health, and not just among poor people, among all of us. The particulates and what we breathe in is affecting our health, and particularly the health of our children. So that's why when I talk about climate, I always talk about climate and health, because it's not just an energy issue, it is also a health issue. So when we think about this big intergenerational transfer of wealth, I think that the older generation needs to join with the younger generation in doing whatever we can to interrupt this cycle of climate change and health impacts. And so from that perspective, we do need governments to address the systemic and structural issues, but we also need businesses and corporations to think that way as well. Just because the President of the United States does not want corporations to care about climate change doesn't mean you shouldn't care about climate change. Frankly, that's a political view of a dinosaur. It is just so out of touch with everything that we know, how we are living, what we are breathing, what we are seeing. We can't be told, don't pay attention to what has happened for political reasons. We have to say, no, we see it, and we're going to respond to it. So The systemic changes in both mitigation and adaptation must continue despite some of the pushback coming from my country in particular. But I want to go further than that. I think businesses, individuals, communities, we all have a role to play and we all have agency. We can do things. We can make a difference. And I remember being in India when I was Secretary of State for official business, of course, with the government. But also I met with businesses and groups of women and activists who were trying to provide cleaner cooking. Now think about that. Clean cooking. Why? Because so much of what is burned for cooking in the world still today is polluting. And the fourth leading cause of death in the world is respiratory illnesses. And there's a huge percentage of those that come to women and children because they are cooking food over polluting fires. And so we launched a big effort to change the way, to create a market for clean cooking utensils. Now that's a small thing, but it could have a big impact. So there is something for all of us to think about doing. And of course, I want to see governments do a much better job of fulfilling their responsibility and not turning the clock back and not pretending that climate change is not real. But I want to see businesses and philanthropies and individuals and communities coming up with their own ideas. And that's why, you know, at the Clean Global Initiative, we partner with all these different groups. We partner with governments and we partner with businesses and we partner with philanthropies and community organizations, because I honestly believe now is the time for us to get creative, focused, and determined to address climate change in all the ways that each of us can. I'm very pleased that you're doing two things today that are about the future. This conference about climate right here in Mumbai, the conference about AI in Delhi. But we can't just talk about this. We've got to do much more to understand more deeply the interconnectivity between AI and climate, and really AI and everything. You know, as of now, it appears, other than, you know, having a conversation or asking a question to whatever, Chat GPT, Claude, Gemini, whoever you're talking to, the biggest advance has been in health. But we've seen some really exciting ways that AI can not just having aggregated information, but analyze it and provide in real time advice to physicians and other health practitioners. That I'm very excited about that. But I think we would be naive not to recognize the potential threats that AI and its development is causing. I mean, we even hear from the people who run these big companies, they don't have any idea what is going to happen. They don't know how these technical advances are going to impact humanity. So if the people creating them don't know, then we have an obligation to say, let's slow down and figure out how we're going to manage this. And you mentioned the energy requirement for AI and the water requirement for running the big data server complexes. How is that going to affect the rest of us? How is that going to affect the energy supply, the cost of energy? How's it going to affect the clean water supply? Because for reasons that I don't pretend to understand, they claim they can't use recycled water. They have to use fresh water. Well, a lot of places in the world don't have an adequate supply of fresh water. So what does all that mean in terms of how we manage reaction to AI? But then the other issue that you alluded to, the labor market issue. What will we do with the millions of people who are going to be displaced because of AI? How will they be able to support themselves? How will society understand and relate to them? What obligation do we have to people who, through no fault of their own, see their jobs totally disappear? How do we get ahead of that problem? Because it's going to happen to us. And then with respect to the climate, in addition to the energy and the water issues, are we going to make sure that whatever information is available is, number one, accurate, so we can rely on it, whatever the data is, but number two, do we have the existing infrastructure to respond? can our grids handle it? I'm speaking for the United States. I don't think our grids can handle whatever the new load is and whatever the new predictions are. So how do we plan for all of this to make it more of a positive than a negative, literally across the world? So I think that the AI conversations that are happening are important, but governments need to be ready to demand answers. The people running these companies are the richest people in the world. These companies are extremely powerful. They want to shape the future. They want to shape the politics of the future in every country in the world, but especially powerful leading countries like India. They want to be the determiners of how you respond to them instead of people through their elected governments determining how they should respond to us. So I think this is a big challenge for governments, but it should also be a challenge for the rest of us to push our governments to respond to. And, you know, a lot of people don't like the idea of regulation, but honestly, I think we've got to be willing to figure out how best to organize and regulate. Because what we learned with social media, we learned too late. Why are countries now regulating social media to try to prevent them from influencing our children? Because we have evidence that children have been negatively affected by social media. They have had greater increases, those who use it the most, or those who are most vulnerable to using it, in things like anxiety and depression and suicide and all the rest of it. But they've also lost their attention. I'll just give you a quick example. So in New York, we just passed a law that children could not bring their phones to school. Now, some people say, well, why'd they ever let them bring the phones to school? Because we didn't understand what a detriment to learning it was. So now we are seeing increased attention spans again in classrooms. We're seeing more engagement between students and teachers. We're seeing students actually talk to each other, not walk around with their heads down looking at their screens. So we learned. It was a hard lesson. It took a decade to learn that lesson. So let's not let AI influence us negatively and then learn the lessons, and it may be too late to try to do anything about energy, water, labor markets, unemployment, hallucinations, delusions that AI promotes. Let's figure out how we can deal with that ahead of time and try to shape it rather than be shaped by it. Do not give in to the naysayers and the cynics. Do not doubt that you are engaged in historic, important work. Of course, you have to understand the politics. You have to understand the markets and the businesses. That is part of being an effective advocate. You have to know how hard you can push, what compromises you can take to try to go farther and get more done because you have built on it and you're ready to go from there. So I think the voices of young people in the global South have to get much louder and much more insistent. And you also have to come up with creative solutions. And then you have to keep knocking on doors till other people listen to you. You know, I remember when I went to the COP conference in Dubai, I met with a group of young activists from the global South. They had extraordinary ideas, but they couldn't get anybody to listen to them. They didn't bring their bankers with them. They didn't have bankers. They didn't know people on boards of directors of companies, but they were rooted in solving the problems they saw in their communities. So we have to be more open and understanding that ideas are going to come from everywhere, and they're going to be good ideas. Most of the global climate financing doesn't go to people like that. And very, very little of it goes to women who are activists and environmental innovators. So let's open our minds, and if you're a young climate activist, keep knocking on those doors, keep making your arguments, keep showing up, come to conferences like this, and keep working together. And, you know, as I said, the Clinton Global Initiative, we will help you. We will help introduce you to people. We will try to find networks that you can be part of. Come to our meeting in September, because this needs to be everybody working together, not one group, not one country, everybody working together. So that's my plea and really my gratitude, because you've got to pick up this baton that we have dropped, and you have to run to the finish line and take the rest of us with you.
Thank you.
I cannot wait for the political change that I know will come to the United States, because that's a few years off.